Good evening, everyone. My name is John Lannon. I work with a migrant support human rights organization called Doris. I'm also an activist with Shannonwatch, who opposed the US military use of Shannon Airport, and I'm a member of STOP, who organized this webinar this evening. And for those of you who don't know us, STOP is an all-island network of peace groups and activists that oppose the war industry. So tonight's webinar is titled Human and Ecological Security, an Alternative to War and Militarism. We have two wonderful speakers with us tonight. We've got Diana Francis, who's a British peace activist and author, and we've got John Maguire, who's also a STOP member and is a member of the board of Afri. Diana has been a lifelong peace campaigner. She spent many years supporting people who were trying to address violent social or political conflict in different parts of the world. She acted as a facilitator, trainer, mediator, and accompanier. She's written several books based on her experience. She's a founding member of Rethinking Security, and she's now a British-based campaigner and activist, I think I can say. John Maguire is a Professor Emeritus of Sociology at University College Cork, and he's the author of a book called Defending Peace that showed how Ireland's foreign policy values of peaceful conflict resolution and the authority of the UN have been eroded by the EU and NATO, but they can be reclaimed. He also authored Maastricht and Neutrality along with Joan Noonan. We could begin by saying that we've got crisis upon crisis unfolding in the world right now. The threat of starvation faces millions of people around the world. In the Horn of Africa alone, the World Health Organization estimates that more than 37 million people are facing acute hunger. There are now more active conflicts in the world, I believe, than at any time since 1945. These are linked to humanitarian crises. You can look at Yemen, South Sudan, Ethiopia, Afghanistan, all over the world. And of course, there's climate change. Extreme weather is becoming more common. Recurring droughts in East and Southern Africa, flash floods in Asia and Latin America, violent windstorms, firestorms affecting even wealthy countries, rising sea levels, and they're all creating new cycles of poverty and of conflict. Because water supplies are shrinking, food prices are rising, people have to abandon their homes. And something that's particularly kind of relevant to my own work is that for the first time ever, earlier this year, the number of displaced people in the world passed 100 million for the first time because of all this. So collectively, we're not doing a very good job looking after each other on the planet. It's becoming a lot less safe, becoming a lot less secure for all of us. And yet we've never had more focus on the word security than ever before in our history. Measures have been taken by states, international organizations like the UN and others with this stated aim of ensuring mutual survival and safety of everybody on the planet, but it's not working. There's now more insecurity for individuals and communities than ever. So I'm going to start with you, Diana, and go back to 2016. I think it was, you had a significant part to play in a discussion paper called Rethinking Security, which you outlined that the problem lies in the dominant narrative of what security means, whom it should benefit, and how it can be achieved. So can you start us off by talking about the problem, I guess, and about your alternative view of security?
Okay, thank you for your excellent introduction. I think the dominant use of the word security is of state boundaries. It's about armies and defense, so-called, because the defense is very often not defensive, and would it help us very much if it were? It's a euphemism, actually, security, and it's a commandeering of a very important word. And it's about the state's defended interests. It's not about people. It's not about the citizens. The people are secondary. And the state's role is to project power, the most loathsome expression, I think, even if use the term soft power. Why should we be protecting power? Power for what? The overarching culture to me is what's driving all this, because it's about domination. That's what this power is about, that you project. It's power to do things, to make things happen, not to have power with other people. And that domination includes power over what we used to and now again called nature. I mean, I was brought up to think, you know, man had dominion over nature. So this is the power model. And we also have a geopolitics that go with that power model. So my alternative view is that we need a culture of cooperation. That seems to be the only thing that makes any sense now, and surely we can see it if we could never see it before, which means power with other people, power for things, power to do things that are desperately needed now, and to make those as well, much focused on the well-being of the planet and of everybody as possible. And that's a big ask, but it's what we need. So it's a geopolitics of cooperation and security for people and planet. And if we don't get that, time's short, so we need to get it soon. And my only hope is that urgency and the slow recognition of our current state will actually drive a change in that cultural approach, that way of thinking. That do?
Okay, thanks. That's a good start, Diana. Thank you. And I think we'll come back to that idea of the culture of cooperation as we go along, and you know, starting us off with that reminder of the focus on the well-being of people and planet is really important. John, I'm going to come to you now. Sure, you may want to comment on that, but I'd also like to bring it back to the Irish context for a few moments. There may be an echo on the line. I just want to check if everybody who isn't speaking could mute, please. It may help us. Thank you. So yeah, the Irish context. First, Europe. So Europe has, as we know, what's called a common security and defence policy. And I went looking at the European Parliament website there over the last day or two, found a press release from last February saying MEPs were calling for, quote, more effective EU foreign and security policy and a strong defence capability to respond to threats. So defence policy, foreign policy, security, they're all thrown in there together. We'll come back to threats later, but let's talk about Ireland's position in relation to all of this. The Department of Foreign Affairs say that Ireland's policy is not prejudiced or affected by the EU security and defence policy. So there's a lot we could talk about there, but let's mention something else that happened last February here in Ireland. The report of the Commission on the Defence Forces. It's a long document. Talks about capability requirements, levels of ambition. And in case you didn't do so, John, I checked for the number of times the word security appears in it. It's 245 times. There's also 48 mentions of NATO, which is quite a lot for a supposedly neutral country. So John, yeah, you've studied it. You studied the white paper that went before it. You've been thinking about this area for quite a long time. Where are we being brought to here in Ireland?
Good question, and I will say something about it. And I certainly like, Diana, the notion of living with and working with people rather than power over people, which certainly I'd like to come back to, and I'm sure we'll return to that. I want to say something very strange, perhaps at the start of my contribution, which is simply that my head is wrecked, and I'm speaking with a wrecked head. I don't think we usually allow enough space for what I regard as a perfect storm that has come over us during this year. I certainly, the Commission on the Defence Forces, about which I'll say more, their report is enough of a problem in its own right. And then we had yet another war, the war in Ukraine landing. It's been, I think, like a car wash of horrors coming. So I think we can find our feet in it, but I want to acknowledge the difficulty of doing so. And you're asking, John, where we're being brought. And I think we've been brought now to the culmination of a process of transformation of the EU along with NATO, really as part of the militarization of the world. And clearly, as you said, this has led to more suffering and more danger. I want to look back to a crucial year, I think. Sometimes we think too much in terms of time. I want to look at it as a space in which Ireland was when we joined the UN. Back in 1955. We joined in 1955, a very auspicious year, a year when the Warsaw Pact was formed, so you have a crystallization of the Cold War. But in the same year, the neutral and non-aligned group first held its first meetings, I think, in Bandung. Ireland was really faced with two paths, if you like, and for a long time has tried to work along both of them. Do we adapt to the Cold War? Do we work with the neutral and non-aligned? The great question of the century, the past century, was decolonization, and Ireland played a modest and useful role, worked for disarmament, and we went in for UN peacekeeping. Now, at the same time, Ireland had a very stagnant economy, and a move was made, a decision was taken by the famous Dr. Whittaker and others to go for foreign direct investment, to open up the economy to what was an emerging neoliberal order. And that led to applying to join the EEC in the 1960s. And already back then, though it wasn't being said publicly, T.K. Whittaker and others were saying, if the EEC demanded we join NATO to let us in, we would have to go along with that. That was never said publicly, but that was said clearly in government circles, which led to what I think has been a twin track approach to European integration, in the sense that the government has maintained all the time there's something abstract called neutrality, and that's quite safe. But then at the same time, they've gone along with a rake of military developments. We've had rapid reaction forces, battle groups, PESCO, and now the Commission on the Defence Forces is recommending that our already fairly shocking Army Rangers Wing, which has been involved in very murky business in Mali and other parts of Africa, should be upgraded to Ireland's Special Operations Force with warfighting capability. Now, that's the same thing as Diana was talking about. There's a clear notion of force projection. In other words, we're not talking about a neutral country which might need to defend itself under certain circumstances. We're going along with the big boys and some big girls. We're involved in force projection, and that has come at the price of our commitment to the UN, where the UN no longer directs peacekeeping, but is used as a rubber stamp for what NATO, the EU are planning. Now, I'm not going to go on much more about that, but I'll mention 2 points about it and then stop for the moment, John. A later development, which goes along, one of the ultimate developments now going along with the Commission on the Defence Forces, is that we are now clearly, or our government are clearly envisaging the building up of the already incipient military-industrial complex in this country. And I've been at a couple of their arms fairs where I have heard our government welcoming the merchants of death into this country to develop that sector of the economy. I'm not saying that merely rhetorically. I quote literally from the most recent of them, where a key participant said, kinetic lethality will still be necessary. So people are talking about the resources for death. And final point, I hope I haven't gone on too long there, final point, we shouldn't kid ourselves that all of these developments are a product of rational analysis and are well-grounded. In fact, these are just markers that were put down, where our government said, we're desperate to get into the game of EEC integration, wherever that takes us. And if it takes us to NATO, as it effectively is doing now, we'll go along with it, but we'll reassure the public at home that something called military neutrality is safe up in the abstract heavens. So that's where they're taking us. I hope to say something about how the picture isn't all that gloomy, but we might as well face what we're being brought into.
Thanks, John. I'm going to refer quickly to a question that just popped in there to leave it with you, John, which was, what was that quote from the arms fair? So you might be able to recall that before the end. Thanks, people who started putting their questions in the chat. Please keep them coming. Any questions, any comments that you have as we go along. Diana, John mentioned Ukraine. And that's very much in our news feeds these days. There's huge human costs to war there. There's also huge damage being done through gas emissions, among other things. That's quite frightening, even just to look at it in the television screens. And that military-industrial complex, the merchants of death, as John said, they're making huge profits out of it all. The direct impact of war right across the world on ecological security is really huge. How do we begin to address that? It's a big question, I know. not possible to answer it in 3 to 5 minutes, but give us some thoughts.
Well, my first thought, it's a war that was long in the making. That's not to take responsibility away from Putin, not in the least. But there was a build-up ever since the ending of the Cold War, where there was an opportunity, a real one, of disbanding NATO and having a common European policy. NATO has enlarged itself and have bases in more and more countries with a bigger and bigger membership. And from Russia's point of view, humiliation and encirclement. And that's how the populations felt. And that's the sort of time when a population will elect somebody like President Putin. And so he's a product of the whole system, as well as, obviously, in human terms, a living agent of it. And it's an extremely cruel war, with immense suffering being caused also to Russian soldiers as well as to Ukrainian civilians and soldiers. A lot of loss of liberty, a lot of conscription, and the damage to the planet is being beautifully, horrifically illustrated, with the smashing of towns and the endless explosion of weapons and the smashing of the countryside, the villages, everything. And if you think about the carbon emissions that go into the manufacture of the weapons, the launching of the weapons, the landing of the weapons, the emissions from that, it's beyond imagination. And all the time, the military system globally already emits 10% of the world's carbon. So it's extraordinary that this is never mentioned. And obviously then the outcome for ordinary people in different parts of the world is terrible, in increased poverty, food shortages, and so on, for people who were already on the breadline, already struggling. And if you think about the other wars that we've stopped taking any notice of now, this overall impact of war is being more vividly than ever illustrated, it seems to me. Well, I was born at the end of World War II, so I didn't see that, but this is utterly terrible, and modern technology doesn't help. And of course, the nuclear threat remains. So we're not out of the woods, and what woods will there be left? Is this human nature? I don't think it is. I don't think this is a compulsion, a necessity. I think it is a cultural thing. We're mostly created by nurture. I don't know who else has seen programs with explanations about how much human beings are formed by nurture as compared with other species. We are made to be kind, we are made to be sociable, and we can be horrid, as I know, as well as anybody else does. But we don't kill each other. We don't regularly, most of us, go round attacking our neighbours or, you know, killing them for having trodden on our garden. It's silly to put that down to human nature. We could choose otherwise. We are agents of our own action, and we just have to learn to think differently. I don't know who else has read Edward O. Wilson's book, The Social Conquest of Earth, which I think came out in 2012. He's dead now. He'll be thankful, I should think, if he could be. And he's saying human beings are the most social species on Earth. Our capacity for cooperation, doing things together, is equaled only by ants. There were lots of chapters about ants, which I didn't read. But, you know, his message is that we could, with our capacities, make a heaven on earth. Well, the clock's ticking on that one. What is there to rescue? We have to rescue it while we can. And we have to find our compassion and our capacity to cooperate. And then we're in with a chance. But if not, well, we can see the writing on the wall. So the time for change is now. And we just have to keep talking and talking and questioning and putting out really very different ideas. But it'll be a hard struggle.
Absolutely, it will. And I think the projection of power that you mentioned earlier is certainly eroding our capacity for cooperation and making it more difficult for us to find our compassion with every day that goes by. And what we need to do and what we're trying to do tonight is to start a conversation around a lot of this. And I was struck by something you said the other day, John, which was that we've been having a conversation for 30 years and the government has resisted here in Ireland. So where do we go here in Ireland now?
Okay, yeah, I do believe that. And I'd just like to let people see, I hope I'm holding it up properly. This is a publication that Afri have just brought out. It's called A Force for Good, ? If people, if they want to, can just note that name, A Force for Good. Some wonderful essays and some stuff by me, but no one's perfect. On the situation and the possibilities of change. And in that, I've written an open letter to the Chief of Staff, General Clancy. I won't go into why I wrote it, but it's in the letter, where I'm tracing what has been called the tortuous path of our development, our joining in, and then our adaptation to the EEC, and particularly to NATO. And we're in a situation, we were told for decades, while we were raising problems, while we were having the conversation, governments were saying, nothing to look at here, nothing to worry about. Then suddenly this year, with the Commission, with the Ukraine war, on top of all the other wars, we're suddenly told, get with the program. You haven't been in touch with reality, whereas we were told for decades nothing was happening. And I think we need to be quite careful of what I call the offside trap. Because government and others are musing about, maybe we'll have a citizens' assembly, maybe we'll start a conversation. They don't do anything to start up the conversation, but it's a situation where they might tailor something that they feel will fit into their plans, and it will be aimed not at conversation, but at conversion. And, you know, I have bases for what I say in my contributions to this book. I'm not simply saying it airily. Time and again, the Commission and our politicians are saying the people need to be made aware of the role of defense, rather than that the people who are sovereign under our constitution should actually decide what happens. Now, in one of the documents they've come out with a couple of years ago, they mused for a while on the idea of town hall meetings. And this is looking at your question, where do we go from here? I think I'm delighted we're having this. It's the beginning of a conversation. We need to broaden the conversation, the study of all these developments we've been doing for more than 30 years, since the Single European Act. And not only do we, may we and should we reclaim Article 6 of the Constitution and say, look here, you are telling us we're to catch up with the program. You've run this illicit program for years. Come back and tell us what you're doing and why. But we also want to reclaim Article 29, which clearly commits us to peaceful conflict resolution and to the rule of international law. And there's a perfect occasion to do this, to set up our town hall meetings, because we're facing now, and this is as relevant in mainland Britain and Northern Ireland as in the Republic, we're facing the 25th anniversary of the Belfast Good Friday Agreement. And if ever there's an object lesson in how not to make a conflict worse, it's the peace process here. So we really ought to be saying, what would Northern Ireland be like if the Troubles 40 years ago had been treated as the situation in Ukraine, Afghanistan, Yemen is being treated now? It seems our government, with celebrations, a free day for St. Bridget next year, and of course the Shamrock to Biden next March, it seems the government want to convert us into an island of saints and soldiers rather than saints and scholars. And I think we need to call them on that. One note I'll really just finish out with, because I know time is short and we want everyone in the conversation. I love the things Diana has been saying, and only recently did I realize, Diana and other people not from Ireland may not know, we actually have 2 official languages in this country. The first official language is Irish. And the section on international relations in our constitution is Cadrev idir náisiúnta. And Cadrev is togetherness, conviviality, cooperation, dialogue. So we have built into our constitution and Article 29 the notion of Cadrev, which is what we want to carry on. And I believe that those town hall meetings can begin to bite as the horrors of what's been happening in Ukraine and elsewhere come home more and more clearly during the coming year. They come home to our refugees and asylum seekers, our NGOs and charities. They know what they're trying to catch up with, our students, and we have to address the trade union movement as well. So I think we have, I can't call it a golden opportunity, an urgent, a vital opportunity for Cadrev, conversation, dialogue among the sovereign people, saying, come here and explain to us how this has anything to do with Article 29 or the Irish peace process. So there's lots we can do.
Thanks, John. There is, and we have to reassure ourselves as that, and to say that we have to keep doing it, and we have to keep bringing in others into the conversation. I like that phrase you use, conversion rather than conversation. That's what's happening. That's what they're at. And they talk a lot about threats as well, and threats to security. Diana, you mentioned that already. You know, we have the discourse of global and international security. We've a lot of talk about national security as well. And in this kind of vision of security, the state, as you said, really plays a central role, as does its military. They're seen as the key agents of security. Threats are associated with border integrity. National security is about building more effective boundaries around the state, preventing the people that are being displaced by climate change and by conflict and humanitarian crisis from entering. And the whole securitization sort of discourse is defined by perceived threats. The borders are fortified. Of course, we see pushbacks of people into the Mediterranean with the complicity of Frontex, which is the European Border and Coast Guard Agency. the pushbacks mean death. People die in the sea, people die in horrendous prison conditions in Libya. But can you talk a little bit more to us about borders, about the role of the nation state when it comes to security? And you know, because we've got to be able to do better when it comes to running the world, particularly when it comes to the security of the people and of nature, as you mentioned already, because that's where the risks really are and where the threats really are.
Well, I think we have to little by little weaken our sense of the state and in fact revolutionize it. I remember going on a flight of some length for the first time, just starting off over Europe and thinking, countries, I can't see any countries. It's just land. It's land, it's forests, it's rivers, it's sea from time to time. Where are these boundaries? This is just land. And on the land, you know, there are people, there are some towns, there are some villages. I wouldn't know whose they were, and I still don't because my geography is absolutely appalling. But what are we talking about? These are our inventions. And the fact that they become these, they must be impervious boundaries, seems to me quite shocking. And the whole asylum rows here and the cruelty just highlight that. I mean, we're people. Most of us had forebears who came from somewhere else, and our children, if they get a life, will probably travel too. It's a nonsense. So I think to a degree, we have to start to understand we live on a single planet, and it has land and it has water, and they're all in danger, and we're all in danger. So that somehow we have to have a different vision of what international relations are like, what national boundaries are for, if anything, how we can, they could be interfaces of cooperation, could they? Would that be a possibility instead of places that you have to police or patrol? It's a huge change to make, but we really have to start making them permeable, not these impermeable things that you have to have certificates for. And I was delighted to hear about the idea of citizens' assemblies and also of other languages. My mother was Welsh speaking, alas, I'm not, but I love the sound of those other languages. And we've got to be, this is about richness. It's not about unification of control, but it's about appreciating. You know, it's like we love different sorts of trees and plants and animals. For goodness sake, can't we love the differences between each other? So to me, that's the most essential thing. And I think if we think about security in terms of physical safety, I don't want the sky to fall on my head, or we need to look after each other's bodies. But that means also economic justice. It means food. It means human rights, some agency. That's human beings need agency. They need to be able to be heard and make a difference, not just to be ignored and pushed into a corner. These are basic human needs. And in the planet itself is absolutely what we depend upon. So if we can change our idea of strength and really understand that we're strong only together, not divided, and we see this crisis as an opportunity for radical change, we're in with a hope. The one planet idea and the urgency of that revolution of understanding seems to me fundamental, with new human priorities. Foreign policy, as it is now, should become international relations policy and work. and diplomacy should be replacing armies, and global disarmament as fast as possible is needed. I know it sounds like saying crazy things, but not saying these things is the craziness. Negotiations, I mean, this is part of what I've done in my life, is helping people to negotiate, learning negotiation skills. I see that in the Washington Post earlier this week, they're talking now about negotiations between Ukraine and Russia. Why now, after all? Why have we been waiting for this to be pushed by the noisy nations? And mediation, peace building, these are things you can learn, to think about constructively and actually put into practice. And I suppose, although it seems to be dreaming and a bit of a no-hoper, but I don't think it is. Hearing Guterres' speech at COP27 and feeling the impact of that, I thought the UN could do a lot if we were only to allow it to be what it was supposed to be. So a reformed United Nations could be a real beacon of hope and a place of utility and importance in international relations, instead of being just forever hamstrung by the Security Council and national interest, or fighting over it and not agreeing with it and doing what we like anyway. So I think there are some kind of recognizable things to be done, but I think that the change of heart and the change of direction are more important than anything.
Yeah. Thanks, Diana. And as I was listening to you talking, there were so many additional questions that were coming into my head that I'd love to spend the night talking with. I'm sure the rest of you have lots of questions and thoughts as well, so keep putting them into the chat. But one that had occurred to me was about the effectiveness, or I should say ineffectiveness, of the UN as a mechanism for cooperation right now, and all of the other forums and mechanisms that are becoming equally ineffective. I was also wondering, about what should we be teaching in our schools and universities right now to change the conversations. But look, I'm going to go to the questions in the chat shortly, but before I do, John, I just want to go back to you and something else you said as we were talking recently. You said security has got to be the conditions to flourish rather than a means to survival. So
Sounds good.
how do we how do we get there? And if you look at it from an Irish perspective, how do we start to untangle, all this foreign affairs policy, defense policy, the security concerns that the government talk about? What needs to happen for security to flourish for everyone?
Yeah, well, I think as regards the tangle of things we've got into, not only do we need the town hall meetings, but I think we might well have something like the Russell Tribunal that looked into the Vietnam War, brought in expertise, gravitas, and popular participation. I think we need that on what has happened our foreign policy. I think that's something we have the expertise, the gravitas, the resources to do. On the question of how we move to a new approach to security, we start from the clear mounting evidence that the militarist definition of security and defense is a disaster, an ever looming, an ever worsening disaster. And one of the problems of this Commission on the Defence Forces is that even in its own realm, it has so muddied the waters that we can't look at what might be real threats that Ireland might need to meet. And that's something that needs to be addressed and hasn't been addressed by them. I love the idea Diana brought up of thinking in new ways, thinking even scandalous thoughts. And it seems to me, as well as our thinking, well, what might be different routes, different pathways to security, I think we need to think, well, what might security mean? In other words, if you go one pathway, you might end up with a different concept of security. And that's where the idea of flourishing comes to me. Someone who influences me a lot is the Polish psychotherapist Alice Miller. And she defined a healthy childhood as a safe space for trial and error. Now, I think we need an adult version of safe space for trial and error, rather than the stupefaction and the infantilization of the militarist concept of security. I think it wrecks our heads. I think it stultifies our thinking. And in a way, yes, we'll need to take the risks of peace. We need, as Diana was saying, to say a lot of risky, stupid things. And I want to throw in, we haven't had any poetry, I want to throw in one of my favorite poets, Conrad Aiken, the US poet. And he says, habitual strength is as much a weakness as habitual weakness. And I think that indicates a path we need to move along. Instead of projecting strength, we need to learn, have cadrev, a cadrev among ourselves, a cadrev with the world, live with the world, the people and planet, rather than on them. And we don't need to reinvent the wheel. We have the Irish peace process. We have the wonderful Rethinking Security. We have World Beyond War and its publications on security. It's more that it will be new to us to think in this way than that we have to invent the whole darn thing for ourselves. That's really where I think we have to go. I think we perhaps need a different orientation rather than more information. I'm not against information, but we have Moses and the prophets. Now we need to direct our minds and our hearts differently. And I would say, and I'll close on this before the questions, I think we need to live with human hope, not godlike power.
Thanks, John. Yeah, there's so much, just as we said earlier, there are so many of these conversations that have been taking place. There's so much great work that has been done already, including the Rethinking Security, so much other stuff that it's there. We just need to find ways to broaden the conversations, to bring others in. There are lots of compliments coming in for both of you on the chat. I'll get to some of them in a minute. You haven't offended anybody, either of you, that's online with us tonight yet.
That's probably
which possibly says something about the audience that we have here tonight. But look, let's look at some of the comments or some of the questions that are here. To what extent does the identification of a country, nation, state with its military play into negative definitions of security? Is that something that John or Diana, that either of you would like to comment on, the role of the militaries? And we're talking here as a country that is supposedly neutral. We're going to have a protest out in Shannon on Sunday evening at a civilian airport that is being used by the US military, and the fact that they pass through it every day is not deemed as a breach of our neutrality, and hasn't been by successive governments. So we seem to have an identification with a foreign military rather than our own military in this context here in Ireland. But negative definitions of security, any thoughts?
Sorry, could you say the question again?
To what extent does the identification of a country, nation, state with its military play into negative definitions of security, in inverted commas?
I'm sure it hugely does, because of the behaviour that goes with that. I mean, yes, when we talk about security policy, I mean, we had an integrated security review last year and the year before, and I think they're zooming up for another one now. And what it does is give more money to the military, a lot more money, and get more nuclear warheads, and actually then, in parallel with that, take lots of money away from international aid. And those are the big takeaways from a security review. So of course people associate the state with and security, its security with the military. And it's so important that we change that, because that means then how other people's governments will then see us as this entity that's bigging itself up for what? It's not a good way to make friends, is it? Except if you're trying to join another club of bullies.
Indeed. John, I'm just going back to the reminder here. There was a request for that quote from the Arms Fair, which you might have come across.
Yeah, I'll tell you now. This is what the person said. It's these weird Chatham House rules. I can't say who was there or who said it, but I can say it was said. And I think I've got the exact words in my notes, but effectively, and these two words were used, this person talking about all kinds of remote things and computers, blah, blah, they said, but kinetic lethality will still be required. In other words, we've got to remember it's about killing people in the end. Okay, that's right. And, you know, in a way, I think the nation state thing, particularly in Ireland, because so much has been sold out without indeed, we've been gaslighted while it's been happening. It's been an abusive process, but we certainly shouldn't be fixated on the nation state. We should defend our constitution, we should defend Irish policy, and we should try to bring them back to what our constitution says. But we're being drawn into a world where we need mayors who work with one another across the planet, where towns and cities set up their own policy, their own approach to things. We need to be thinking on a local and global way, with the nation state to be, if you like, reclaimed and redesigned in policy terms in between. And there's one word I'd love to throw in here, but I mean, I've said some stuff in this, A Force for Good. I hope people will get hold of it. It will be launched soon. It's available from Afri. It will eventually be online, but we're having a launch of the hard copies at the moment. And I hope people will enter into the conversation that starts. But there's one word I want to throw into the discussion, and that is a word the militarists use, and it's asymmetry. There's a lot of talk about asymmetrical warfare. Now, I think our work, our struggle, our cadre and creativity has to be asymmetrical. In other words, our minds will be totally trapped if we try to come up with an alternative to war. If we try to match everything war is doing and say, well, we can do that better. No. You know, there's an awful lot to be said for not killing people, for not threatening people, for not infantilizing them. Then human life can happen. I don't mean that's everything, but for heaven's sake, most people, most of the time, are not fighting other people, as Diana was saying. Most people, even in our dreadfully threatened world, are making homes and lives with one another. We have the resources there, and an asymmetrical creative richness can grow out of that.
Absolutely. Diana, did you want to come back in?
Well, what John was saying made me think about people-to-people diplomacy, that maybe, as well as having our own local democracies and conversations at home, we should be, as you suggest with the mayors, I mean, or anybody, we should have transnational networks where actually nation stops mattering, and what we think about is the common concerns that we share, and maybe then what we can do in our different places. But I think we have to break away from the militarist nationalist governments and not dependent on them for our future security, because then we're in a deep hole. We have to dig our own way out.
Yeah, Diana, that leads quite nicely to another question in the chat that I want to go to, which is there a role for global civil society as distinct from nation states in promoting human and ecological security?
That's another way, and a good way of saying what I was trying to say, and it's perhaps slightly less articulately. Yeah, I think it happens, and I think it can happen more. And I think movements across the world can support each other. I happen to be a member of Extinction Rebellion in the UK. And it's absolutely inspiring beyond anything to see that in just about any country you care to mention, there are actions going on which may be very different, they may be similar, but it's people. I mean, it really lifts the soul. We do have souls. We may not have a God, but we have souls. And connecting at that level is really important, because we have to find a different kind of energy. It can't be the energy, you know, fighting the good fight. I was thinking about, and, you know, do I want to fight for anything? I've got to find another word. We need to change our vocabulary. But we need to lift each other up, and we need to lift up new values.
I'd love to come in on that, if I may, just quickly. One of the most significant meetings I ever had was in Cork in the mid-1990s, when the white paper on foreign policy was being developed. The government brought over Erskine Childers III, grandson of the man involved in the independence struggle here, son of the president, had a huge lifelong career with the UN. Erskine Childers was brought in as an expert. He gave an astonishing paper on what needed to be done and what should be done. He talked about the Security Council as a reliquary cabal and said, let's not bother with them. And he and the late Brian Urquhart, they both worked for example, a second General Assembly of non-governmental organizations. Now, I went up, I was so moved, I said, Mr. Childers, that was just wonderful. He kindly shook my hands and gave me the speech, gave me his own speaker's text. I haven't made enough use of it, and I hope through Afri we can publish it. But he spelled out what Ireland could do, and Karen Devine spells out in this publication. By the way, I haven't got shares in Afri, I won't make any money out of it, but Karen Devine spells out, you know, it's been done before. We don't need to reinvent the wheel. Ireland was making a modest contribution to the world in the 1950s. Frank Aiken was doing it. Not only does Karen Devine historically look at his legacy, but she even says what a difference his approach would make in Ukraine now. By the way, I haven't been following the chat. I have seen one question: have we condemned Putin for his aggression? I've been working on the basis that we condemn all aggression. Yeah. I certainly condemn all aggression. That response to whatever NATO was doing was totally unjustified. Okay, totally unjustified.
Thanks for noting that question, John. I was going to come back to it because it was one that is easy to answer. The answer is yes. We do condemn it.
Time and again.
Yes. I know we're nearly there in terms of time, but two sort of issues that have come up in a number of the comments or questions. And I hope, by the way, that we'll capture all of this chat. Somebody might give me a thumbs up in the chat just to confirm that we will have it all, because as part of the conversation, there's some really interesting and thought-provoking commentary in there as well that we need to capture. But language and the media are two points that have come up. Our language certainly has been debased. You know, we talk about plans of attack these days. You know, we've got people working in organizations all over the world that are referred to as officers now. You know, we talk about frontline workers. You even quite rightly pointed out to me the other day, Diana, that I made a reference to bullet points, which was very true. I had and shouldn't have. So the debasing of language, the television programs that we're watching that glorify, that attempt to sanitize war is really troubling. The other thing that I want to just ask you if you have any thoughts on as well is on the role of our media, what we often refer to as our mainstream media. One person commented in the chat that our media in Ireland are locked down. When RTE want an opinion on Ukraine, they head straight to a London laundromat Tory think tank. Yeah, and any thoughts or comments on either of those?
Well, I mean, my own comment as somebody who lives in the UK is that if you watch the national news on the BBC, which for some things is very good, and in some things is fairly even-handed, but when it comes to any sort of military thing, the nation's position is taken. There is no questioning of anything that's happening somewhere else. For instance, the war in Afghanistan, we would hear daily about the deaths of British soldiers. We never heard about the horrible deaths of Afghan people. It was just, things are not questioned. Yeah, it's just fed to you, fed to you, fed to you. So that worries me a lot. I'm not a social media user. I'm a dinosaur in that respect. I just can't take it all in, and I don't work that fast. But I think the potential for good may be there, but also the potential for harm is quite big as well. And I think somehow we have to get very canny in a positive way, skilled, in actually using language differently and really digging deep, try and express what it is we're trying to say, not just use the same old phrases all the time. Because if we don't do that, I think we have to speak from the heart, and that's difficult to do. It's not normal, and it doesn't happen much in the media. But when you do get some sort of an interview that's really personally and powerfully expressed, you take notice.
Absolutely. Thanks, John.
I'd love to say something about media and then quickly something about language. With the open letter, and I've begun my critique of the Commission on Defence Forces report in this, but I'm hoping over the next year or so to develop more and more of a conversation. I'm calling it Téada, which is the Irish for strings, trying to string things together and string my unruly mind together. So there'll be much more to come. And one of the things I want to dwell on is language. I mean, I've been in these arms fairs, these webinars, where people talk about incubators for enterprises which will build rockets, which will destroy babies and incubators in the places they're aiming at. They actually talk about the end user of weapons. The end user of weapons is not the person in whom they end up. The end user is the soldier or the person at a desk who's actually going to apply them. Language has become unmoored from reality. The last webinar, where they were welcoming the merchants of death, was called Building the Ecosystem. They really think they need to build an ecosystem to develop the weapons. Buckminster Fuller had a wonderful word, livingry. He said, we need livingry, not weaponry. We need to stop sacrificing our livingry to weaponry that then goes on and threatens the bit of livingry we've been left with. But on media, the clampdown is extraordinary. And I want to mention, you know, sometimes in some of the papers, you get a bit of a mention, but two sources that for me show what's been happening to our policies are the People's News, which comes from the People's Movement. Google People's Movement, and they regularly, if you want to know what's happening in the EEC, the EU, NATO, they have chapter and verse. And I cannot emphasize too much the importance of the Phoenix magazine. It's a kind of private eye, an Irish equivalent of private eye. I won't say version, but an equivalent of private eye here. And quite genuinely, it is the only academic source on what is happening to Irish defence policy, time and again. And in the recent budget, 9% VAT was to be taken off all periodicals, and then suddenly it turned into only newspapers. So Phoenix will be left with its 9% VAT on top of its very modest operation. Another part maybe of the clampdown, certainly Phoenix regards it as a very negative move. I would say to anyone who can afford to, please, I don't hold shares in Phoenix either, please take out a subscription. If we lose the Phoenix, we are in dire trouble as regards what's happening. And that shows the extent of the clampdown in the mainstream media.
Thanks, John, and thanks, Diana. We're actually out of time. It feels like we've only been chatting for 15 or 20 minutes, but yeah, we've talked for an hour. I must apologize to everybody whose questions or comments we didn't get around to. As I said, I want to make sure that we've got a full record of that.
Good.
There are some questions that John and Diana, I would like just to ask you, if you didn't mind after this, just to address specifically. There's one from Declan there, whom I think it'd be good to just respond to in terms of it's just in relation to the ideas, as he said, that emerged from the Rojava and the aftermath of the Syrian civil war, women's liberation, ecological justice, democratic confederalism. Have you worked with any of the women? What do you think of this model? I'm not going to ask you to respond to that now, but there are other questions like that we'll capture, and we'll find a way to respond, I hope, between us to all of those. This was a really interesting start to the conversation. It's going to be much bigger. It's going to be much broader than this, we hope. I'm going to finish with just some lines, if I can find it now, from the concept note that set this webinar in motion from our friend Eamon Rafter, who's of STOP, who's on this call with us. And he wrote about widening the conversation about security and how current military responses are causing human suffering, environmental harm across the world, making us less safe. There is a better alternative that we should be exploring. We need to, that we do have real threats to our climate, to our health, to the places we live in, and so on and so forth. We do need a different approach, Eamon has quite rightly said, and that can only emerge from a wide, inclusive conversation that involves people from all sectors of society. Yeah. And I think this is really important, a really important point. You know, and as Eamon said as well, rather than telling people what's good for them, we need to invite them into the conversation. This needs to be a conversation that everybody is part of. It certainly needs to be one that the people who are most effective by the real threats that exist in the world today are part of. So I want to thank you, John, also you, Diana, for your really interesting reflections and thoughts tonight. And let's keep this going. Thanks to everybody else who took part tonight as well, and for all the comments and questions, and for being here with us. We'll keep this going in STOP. This is only the beginning. We will not stop when Swords to Ploughshares. And thanks everybody for being part of it tonight, and have a good rest of day. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.